Hey everybody, Bobby from New Jersey, back for another brewing video, and this time we're talking about episode 4 of the all grain primer series. Now in episode 3 I talked about how various temperature rests in a mash will affect the sugar makeup of the wort and why we might want to rest at different temperatures at certain stages of the mash. In this episode we're going to talk more about how we actually achieve those rest temperatures and we'll also go over some of the equipment used for the mashing and how they each lend themselves to certain processes or mash schedules. So let's talk about the mash vessels. I like to say that you could use just about anything for a mash vessel. As long as it holds grain and water, it'll hold a mash. But for practical purposes, there are really two different types, okay? Metal vessels and insulated beverage coolers that are pretty popular. So the first thing, right, everybody probably started off with a turkey fryer pot, either in stainless like this one or aluminum. It's a 7.5 gallons, but it could also be a converted keg or any metal vessel, okay? So one of the big advantages to a metal container or metal vessel for your mash tun is durability. You're mashing and you're stirring your mash with a mash paddle, and you can be pretty aggressive with it. You can clean it really well because it's not delicate. It's going to last a really long time, and so that's certainly one of the advantages. Not one of the biggest things, but it's certainly worth noting. The other advantage is that it's direct fire capable. In other words, you can take your mash in a pot, put it right on a burner. If you need to make temperature adjustments, you can do that. The metal vessel can take the direct heat. On the other hand, its major negative is that it doesn't have good heat retention capabilities. So if you were trying to hold a mash for 60 minutes at a solid temperature, without doing things like insulating, you really can't expect it to hold temperature. It'll probably lose 8 to 10 degrees Fahrenheit over the course of a 60-minute mash, and of course that depends on what the ambient temperature is and things like that, but they really don't hold heat on their own very well. So that's where the beverage cooler really does shine, okay? So this is a Igloo ice cube. This one's square, but I mean the same thing applies to the rectangular coolers like the Coleman Extreme, or cylindrical coolers like the 5 and 10 gallon beverage dispensing coolers that you find at like Home Depot. So that's really what their major advantage is that they hold heat really well. If you set them up properly and you have you anticipate the heat that they're going to pull out of the mash from the vessel itself, you can really expect these to hold a solid temperature, maybe losing 2 degrees Fahrenheit over a 60-minute mash. So they really do offer a hands-off type of temperature maintenance. On the con side, some people are adamantly against using hot liquids that are going to be consumed into plastic holding vessels. There's fears of all sorts of different chemicals leaching out and things like that. Now, thousands of home brewers use beverage coolers as mash tuns without any, noted effects. But, the truth is that if you were to contact the manufacturers and ask them if it was okay to put hot liquids in their coolers and then consume that liquid, they would never give that okay because they don't have FDA approval on that sort of usage. The debate is still raging out there. It sort of crops up every once in a while, and there are just people who are just adamantly against using plastics and those who don't care. I'm going to leave that up to you. I don't really know one way or the other which is true, but they are very convenient to convert into mash tuns, and they hold temperature really well. Now, one thing for sure, they don't have the durability that a metal vessel has. Whether they leach chemicals or not, the higher temperatures that the plastic is exposed to causes a lot of expansion and contraction issues. So you'll find after the first time you use it for mashing, you're going to see that the inside walls do a little bit of warping, especially if it's a smaller cooler. All that plastic really has no place to go, and it's going to buckle the walls of the plastic of the cooler. So there's really no way around that. Now, Whether or not that ends up causing you any problems remains to be seen. I know I know that when I see a cooler that has been used as a mash tun, it's obvious right away that it has been used as a mash tun. The interior walls are bubbled and looks pretty bad. Eventually the cooler is going to wear out and the plastic's going to crack, so you'll have to replace it every few years. It's not really that big of a deal, but that is certainly one of the factors. And then finally, one of the issues with plastic coolers is that even though they hold heat really well, on the other hand, they can't be direct fired like a metal mash tun can be. So temperature adjustments have to be handled through external means, and there's plenty of different ways to go about that, and we're going to talk about that later. But you could see that choosing either one of the vessel types is certainly a compromise to some degree, and I hope that after this talk, you'll be better equipped to make that choice for yourself. Okay, let's shift gears a little bit. We'll talk about mash schedules. Okay, so a mash schedule can be thought of as a line graph where the vertical axis is temperature and the horizontal or x-axis is time. So you can describe what's happening with the mash from the moment you dough in or stir the strike water with the grain until you run the wort off into your boil kettles. So the first and most common method is called the single infusion mash, and I just want to clarify, the word infusion is really just a fancy way of saying mixing or adding water to grain. There's nothing special about that particular word, but we like to use it as brewers. So the idea is that we want a single mash rest temperature, and we're going to achieve that single temperature by infusing or mixing in strike water of a certain temperature. Now, through a lot of different factors, you're going to equalize down at a single temperature. Some of the things that affect what that temperature is going to be is the strike water itself, the temperature of the grain that you're mixing it into, the ratio of the strike water to the grain, and then finally what your mash vessel makeup is and what temperature it's been sitting at. In other words, if it's a heavy keg sitting in 30-degree Fahrenheit ambient temperatures in a garage overnight, for example, is going to take a lot of heat away, as opposed to a thinner metal pot sitting at room temperature. So that also affects it. Now, I could flash up some math formula on the video to say, here's how you figure out what temperature you need to use. Now, it's really impractical to do that because I don't know too many brewers who love doing math, and I don't like doing it myself. So I'm going to tell you the easy way out is to get yourself some brewing software, whether it be Beer Tools Pro or Beersmith or Pro Mash, whatever it may be. Whatever your favorite brewing software is, or whatever your friends recommend, go for it, because as far as I can tell, all of them have calculators built in to the mash scheduler, or whatever they happen to call it, for figuring out what the strike temperature really should be based on your desired mash temperature. Now, there are a few different ways of removing the mash tun heat capacity or heat makeup out of the equation by doing things like preheating and stuff like that. But you can train your software by inputting certain data to compensate for any heat qualities or thermal qualities of that mash tun. So you don't have to do any preheating or anything like that. I do have a separate video showing how you apply that data to Beer Tools Pro, so check that out if you care. Now, as a simple rule of thumb, you have to use strike water that's about 10 to 15 degrees Fahrenheit over your desired mash temperature. And that range is so wide because, there's, like I said, there's a lot of different factors. But it would be a good bet to start with 10 degrees over your desired mash temperature. And of course, you can always adjust the temperature with a little bit of boiling water or ice water in small volumes to make small adjustments in temperature. But as you get to know your system better and better, you'll actually be able to anticipate what your strike temperature needs to be. Well-insulated mash tuns like the coolers really do lend themselves to this process, because for the most part, you hit your desired temperature, you close the lid, and you walk away for 60 minutes. So that's nice and convenient. So if a single rest doesn't accomplish your goals, you can try a multiple rest mash, or what's called the step mash, where you hit 2 or more different deliberate temperatures throughout your mash schedule. Okay, so some of the reasons you would do that is, like, if you wanted to hit a protein rest because you have a lot of adjuncts at, say, 122, and then you want to step up to your saccharification rest in the low 150s or mid 150s, and then maybe you want to bring it up to a mash out at 168 degrees. Again, we talked about all these different rest points in episode 3, so I'm not going to go over why you would do that, but you can go ahead and check out episode 3 for that. So there's a few different practical ways of hitting these rest temperatures depending on what your mash tun is and what you want to do. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the infusion step mash. Now, we talked about the infusion mash where, you know, you're putting hot water into the grain to reach a certain temperature. No matter what mash schedule we're talking about in this video, you always arrive at your first rest temperature through the infusion of your strike water. Okay, so I just wanted to clear that up right away. So it's how you achieve the next temperature and above that really varies depending on how we do it. So in the infusion step mash, we reach our single temperature initially through the strike water infusion, but we can actually raise the temperature by adding more hot water at various stages. One thing we have to do usually with the infusion step mash is that we have to start our initial step, or our dough-in step, with a thicker mash. In other words, we want to stick to a lower ratio, something like 1 quart of strike water per pound of grain. So that you can leave some additional volume in the tun for all these additional steps, okay? Another thing we do is we try to minimize the volume of the water that we use for our various infusions or our steps. So in order to make the temperature jumps effective, we have to raise the temperature of those infusions, and using boiling water isn't all that uncommon. Okay, so if you wanted to step up from, say, 120 degrees Fahrenheit from a protein rest up to a high saccharification rest like 156, that's a pretty big jump, and you can use your brewing software to figure out how much boiling water it would take to bring that mash from 120 up to 156, okay? And it's, you know, it's gonna, depending on the batch size and everything, it's gonna be something like a gallon and a half or something like that if it's boiling. Okay, I also want to summarize that the mash vessel that you use for this process is of real no consequence, because you're only infusing water into the vessel, so coolers or metal vessels are fine. So the next process for changing your multiple rests or doing step mashing is actually called decoction mashing. It's very similar to the intent of the infusion step mash, except for the fact that you're actually not adding any additional water to the mash. It's not based on infusions. Any heat added is actually external to the mash tun. So how this actually works is that you'll take about 1/3 of your entire mash out of the mash tun, including, you know, and I'm talking mostly thick grain. You just scoop it out with a saucepan or something like that, and you put it into a separate kettle, and you heat that on a burner until it boils. And for the most part, you're going to boil it for, you know, 15 to 30 minutes, maybe longer depending on the type of recipe. But the point is you raise that temperature to boiling, and when you add that back into the main mash, you effectively change the equalized temperature. Again, it's very complicated figuring out exactly how much volume it takes to make those temperature moves, but it's such a historic process that, you know, you can actually read up recipes that include the decoction schedule and all the appropriate volumes and things like that. This process is really only adhered to for staying true to history. If you're trying to do some authentic recipes, I know Hefeweizens really do benefit from them. The thing is that there's a lot of debate as to whether or not the benefits can be duplicated by using modern malts and using caramels or crystal malts and things like that. One of the things that the decoction mash process does is, while you're boiling the thick mash, you're developing these melanoidins, which are these flavors of like cooked, or I should say baked bread, like bread crusts. It's that really intense caramel flavor. It also adds some color to the process. Of course, you can fake that by using darker crystal malts, but one of the things I want to point you to is Kai Troster is a German homebrewer who has a lot of information about it. He knows more about decoction than I'll ever know, so I'm not going to pretend to be an authority on that. So one thing is for sure, that the decoction process, even a single decoction process to hit 2 different rest temperatures, it elongates your brew day by at least a half hour to an hour. So you can imagine doing a triple decoction can turn a 5-hour brew day into a 9-hour brew day. So I just wanted to mention that you could try it, but I don't think it's something you're going to do very often if you don't like spending you know, a whole day in your brew house. Now, the last of the common step mashing techniques or processes is called the direct fire process, and like the others that I mentioned earlier, the first rest temperature is achieved through an infusion of strike water. So again, that's the same. But the main difference is that the mashing vessel has to be metal and it sits directly on a burner, and you use the direct flame to achieve each of the rest temperatures. Now, the caveat here is that the brewer really has to be diligent in stirring the mash while the flame is on, so that you don't scorch the grains, as the grains that sit on the very bottom of the pot are trapping, you know, the bit of moisture right at the bottom, and it can actually overheat and burn the sugary wort right to the bottom of the pot, and that'll taste horrible and it'll be a cleaning mess. So you have to stir really well. And the other thing too is that you don't want to overheat the grain at the very bottom of the tun, because you don't want to denature all the enzymes in the wort at the bottom. So you should just keep stirring to keep it more consistent throughout the heating process. One thing I also want to mention is that in the previous techniques, you're really achieving these steps, you know, where it's one temperature and then it ramps up very quickly and then you hit another temperature. So it does look like steps where the vertical part or the temperature change is very quick. In a direct fire mashing process, I would actually describe this more as ramp mashing or slope mashing, where from one temperature rest to the next is actually a more gentle slope. It's more like a 45-degree angle rather than a vertical jump up to the next temperature. Now, as long as the heating times are relatively consistent from batch to batch, I think you can get similar results. So it's not that it's an inferior method. I just wanted to mention that, you know, as a part of the ramping process, you're sort of transitioning from one temperature to the next more slowly. Again, you can't do this in a cooler because you can't apply a direct flame. So if you want to step mash in a cooler, you have to use either your infusion step mashing or decoction mash to accomplish those temperature changes. So in summary, infusion mashing reaches either single or multiple rest temperatures purely by infusing water of a certain temperature. Decoction mashing adds heat to the mash somewhat indirectly by heating a portion of the mash in a kettle and then adding it back into the main mash. And then finally, direct fired step mashing adds heat with a burner underneath the mash vessel. We also talked about the pros and cons of the 2 major mashing vessels, metal pots and plastic coolers, and how the latter lends itself to infusion mashings. But it also could be used for the occasional decoction as long as you have a separate kettle, which of course you do. Metal tuns can be direct fired, such as in direct fire step mashing process, and it can also be your boil kettle. So for people who don't really want to invest the money into a separate mashing vessel, can make use of their boil kettle for this process.